Have you ever met someone you knew you shouldn't fall for? Yet every moment with them pulled you closer, like gravity ignoring every rule you lived by. From the very beginning, her life had been shaped by simplicity and discipline. Growing up in a modest village, she was taught that dignity comes not from wealth, but from hard work, honesty, and self-respect. Her family lived from day to day, yet they believed in honor, in setting boundaries, and in holding onto values no matter how unpredictable the world became. So when the opportunity came for her to work as a maid in the city, inside a mansion owned by one of the most influential businessmen, she accepted it not with excitement but with quiet determination. She wasn't chasing dreams of glamour, she was chasing survival. Her goal was straightforward: earn enough to support her family, stay focused, avoid mistakes, and keep her life simple. She stepped into that mansion with the mindset of someone who understood her place in the world and intended to stay within it. On her first day, as she walked through the massive iron gates and into the marble-lined hallway, she felt the intimidation seep into her bones. Everything around her was grand. Tall staircases that spiraled like polished sculptures, chandeliers dripping with crystals, walls decorated with paintings she didn't even understand. It felt like stepping into a different universe, one governed by money, power, and expectations she was afraid to even imagine. Instinctively, she straightened her posture, lowered her gaze, and reminded herself of the rules she had always followed. Stay humble, stay quiet, stay invisible. This was not her world. Her purpose was simple labor: cleaning floors, preparing rooms, ensuring everything remained perfect for people whose lives were nothing like hers. The mansion might have been beautiful, but she knew beauty wasn't meant for her to admire, only to maintain. Before she even met him, her boss, she had heard stories whispered among the senior maids, stories about his influence, his intelligence, his demanding perfectionism, and above all, his charm. They said he was a man who could silence a room simply by walking into it. Some described him as intimidating, others called him respectable. But one word was always repeated: captivating. The girls spoke of him the way people speak of fire. Dangerous if you're careless, mesmerizing if you stare too long. Hearing all this, she promised herself that she would never let curiosity lead her astray. She wasn't there to form impressions of him. She wasn't there to get noticed. In fact, the idea of speaking to him directly made her nervous enough that she prayed their paths would rarely cross. She believed distance was the safest shield she could carry. The job itself demanded precision. Waking before sunrise, preparing the house, ensuring every detail was flawless. These responsibilities became her daily rhythm. Though she was new, she worked with a quiet excellence that others quickly noticed. She didn't talk much, didn't complain, didn't attempt to fit into gossip or distractions. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was discipline. She had boundaries, and she clung to them with both hands. The mansion staff had seen many people come and go, some overwhelmed by the pressure, others seduced by the lifestyle. But she was different. She didn't want to impress. She didn't want attention. All she wanted was stability. But life has an odd way of shifting when you least expect it, and her quiet competence slowly began to change how others saw her. Despite her efforts to remain unnoticed, her dedication made her stand out. The senior staff admired her reliability. The house manager appreciated her respect for the rules. Every task she touched seemed to be done with an unusual level of care. She was not only hardworking but genuine, a rare trait in a place where people often hid behind masks. Some colleagues tried to befriend her, but she maintained a polite distance. She believed closeness led to complications, and complications were the last thing she needed. Still, even without words, her presence spoke. She was strong, humble, and pure-hearted, the type of presence that stabilizes a space without ever trying, and unknowingly, she started becoming a quiet but steady breath within the mansion, a presence impossible to ignore forever. Yet, despite her growing comfort in her routine, she never forgot the warnings about her employer. Whenever she heard footsteps approaching, she would lower her eyes. Whenever she sensed someone important nearby, she would step aside. She lived with constant awareness, constantly reminding herself of the delicate line between employee and employer, a line she had no intention of crossing. But destiny doesn't always respect boundaries. And although she didn't know it yet, the very world she was trying to stay invisible in was already beginning to shift around her. Because sometimes all it takes is a moment, one unexpected encounter, for everything a person believes to be redefined. From the very first moment she saw him, the air around her shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably real. It was early morning, and she was polishing the glass railing near the staircase when he entered the hallway. His footsteps were calm, confident, unhurried, the kind of steps made by someone who controlled everything in their world. She felt him before she saw him, a quiet presence that pulled her attention instinctively. When she finally raised her eyes, even just for a second, she realized why the staff spoke of him the way they did. He carried an aura that filled the space effortlessly, sharp, refined, powerful. Yet his eyes carried something deeper, something warm beneath the surface. She immediately looked down again, embarrassed at the idea of being caught staring. But in that single moment, something inside her shifted, as though a door she never meant to open had quietly unlocked itself. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that she had simply reacted to his authority, the way anyone would when facing someone important. But the truth was more complicated. There was something about him that drew her attention without permission, not in a bold or reckless way, but in a soft, magnetic pull that she couldn't quite explain. When he spoke to the house manager nearby, his voice carried a calm confidence that made her chest tighten for reasons she didn't fully understand. He wasn't loud. He wasn't arrogant. He simply existed with a kind of quiet intensity that made it impossible not to notice him. And while she reminded herself to remain focused on her work, she couldn't deny that something about him lingered in her thoughts long after he walked past her. Over the next few days, their paths crossed in small, almost accidental ways. A simple nod of acknowledgement from him when he passed through the dining hall. A brief moment when he held the door open as she carried a tray of linens. A soft thank you when she handed him a document the house manager needed him to sign. Each interaction was professional, respectful, properly distanced. Nothing inappropriate, nothing alarming. And yet, every time he spoke to her, even in the simplest terms, she felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hated that she reacted this way. She told herself it was just admiration, nothing more. After all, anyone would be intimidated by someone so composed, so accomplished, so effortlessly graceful in the way he carried himself. But her heart reacted faster than her mind could rationalize. What surprised her most, however, was the way he seemed to notice her presence, not in the way a boss watches over an employee, but in a quieter, more observant manner. When she entered a room, his eyes would flicker toward her just briefly, as if acknowledging she had arrived. When he spoke to the staff, his tone softened slightly when addressing her, though he seemed unaware of the shift himself. And during one morning meeting with the household employees, she caught him watching her as she arranged fresh flowers on the table. His gaze steady but thoughtful, like he was seeing something he wasn't used to noticing. The moment their eyes met, she quickly looked away, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know whether he was intrigued, or simply curious about why she avoided his gaze more than anyone else did. Despite his calm exterior, there was a warmth in the way he interacted with people, a kind of gentle patience not often found in men of his status. And that warmth, combined with the natural charisma he carried, became the most dangerous part of all. It made him human, it made him approachable, it made her forget, even if only for a few seconds, that he was her employer and she was a maid. Whenever he smiled, rare, unintentional, but genuine, she felt a flutter in her stomach she could never admit aloud. The house staff had warned her that he had a charm capable of making anyone feel seen, heard, and valued. She now understood why. His presence didn't just command a room. It drew people toward him like a soft, irresistible current. And she, despite all her boundaries and reservations, was not immune. She told herself repeatedly that she had to stay careful. Attraction, if that's even what this was, had no place in her life, especially here. She had come to this mansion to survive, not to feel anything. And yet, no matter how much she tried to distance herself, the quiet pull between them kept returning like a tide. She wasn't foolish enough to call it love. She wasn't even brave enough to call it interest, but she felt something real, something uninvited. And though she tried to hide it, bury it, silence it, the truth remained. Her heart had begun to notice him long before her mind allowed her to admit it. She had always lived her life with a clear understanding of limits. Boundaries weren't just rules to her. They were protection, comfort, and survival. So when she noticed her heart reacting to him in ways she couldn't control, panic began quietly building inside her. It started with small things, lingering thoughts when she wasn't working, an unexpected warmth in her chest when she remembered his smile, a sudden flutter when she replayed the sound of his voice. These feelings felt foreign, almost unwelcome, like strangers knocking on a door she kept tightly locked. Every night as she prepared for bed, she scolded herself silently. "You're here to work. Nothing more." But the heart, stubborn and unpredictable, refused to obey the rules she had spent her entire life following. Each morning, she would wake up determined to control herself better than the day before. She would remind herself of the reality, of the vast distance between them, the difference in their status, their lives, their worlds. She was a maid. He was her boss. Even imagining anything beyond that felt wrong, almost foolish. And yet, the moment she stepped into the mansion and sensed his presence somewhere inside, all her self-discipline dissolved into uncertainty. She hated how aware she was of him, how her posture straightened instinctively when she knew he might appear, how her breath caught when footsteps approached, how she suddenly forgot what she was doing whenever he entered the room. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something she wanted, but emotions rarely ask for permission before they begin their quiet invasion. The real conflict inside her grew the day she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It was afternoon, and she was arranging documents in the study after the house manager had assigned her there. She thought she was alone until she felt a distinct shift in the air. Turning slowly, she saw him leaning slightly against the doorframe, watching her with a thoughtful calmness, as though trying to understand something about her. She froze, unsure whether to speak or leave. His eyes held no judgment, no irritation, only a quiet, unreadable softness. That moment was brief, no more than a few seconds, but her heart reacted with such intensity that she felt almost dizzy. When he finally spoke, "You're doing well here," his tone was warm, sincere, and dangerously gentle. She mumbled a shy thank you and immediately lowered her gaze. But after he left, she stood there trembling, shaken not by his words, but by her own feelings. From that day forward, her internal struggle became even harder to ignore. She found herself avoiding places where she might run into him, yet simultaneously feeling disappointed when she passed through the mansion without encountering him at all. She hated this tug-of-war inside her, this constant battle between logic and emotion. Her mind repeated warnings like a protective guardian. "Keep your distance, do not let him affect you." But her heart whispered in quiet rebellion, "He's kind, he sees you." She tried to bury one voice beneath the other, but the conflict only intensified. It was as though two versions of herself were fighting, one grounded in reality, the other pulled by emotion she didn't understand and never expected. The hardest part was the guilt. Not guilt because she had done anything wrong, but guilt simply for feeling something she believed she shouldn't. She often wondered whether her emotions were a sign of weakness, a failure of her discipline, or a betrayal of her upbringing. She feared becoming someone who lost control, someone who misread kindness as affection, someone who fell into a fantasy that had no place in her life. It wasn't just fear of rejection or humiliation. It was fear of losing herself. She had worked so hard to build a life defined by strength and stability. And now a single man, a man she barely spoke to, a man she had no right to think about, was unraveling that stability with nothing more than his existence. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to silence her emotions, a quiet truth began forming in her heart. She wasn't reacting to charm or status or appearance alone. It was the way he treated people, with respect, with calmness, with sincerity. It was the way he looked at her, not as a servant, but as a human being whose presence mattered. That truth made her conflict even deeper. Because if her feelings had been shallow, temporary, or based on fantasy, she could have dismissed them easily. But real feelings, the kind that grows silently, naturally, without force, are far harder to escape, and beneath her layers of fear, guilt, and resistance, she knew she was facing something she couldn't ignore forever. The days that followed carried a tension she could feel in her bones, quiet, invisible, yet unmistakably present. Something between them had shifted, not through words or confessions, but through the silent gravity that pulled them into the same orbit. Every time she stepped into a room and sensed he might be there, her heartbeat quickened in a way she couldn't control. It wasn't just nervousness anymore. It was anticipation, fear, curiosity, and something softer, something dangerously close to longing. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, but everything inside her said otherwise. Even the mansion's atmosphere felt different, as though the very walls had begun observing the unspoken connection building between them. Their interactions remained simple, polite, appropriate, yet they carried an undercurrent she could no longer ignore. When he spoke to her, even about something trivial, his voice dipped into a gentler tone he didn't use with anyone else. When he passed by, his gaze lingered half a second longer than necessary, subtle but unmistakable. Once, as she was arranging books on a shelf, he walked past her and paused like he wanted to say something, but instead offered only a small, thoughtful smile. That smile stayed with her the rest of the day, haunting her with questions she didn't dare ask. She would lie awake at night, trying to convince herself she was imagining all of it, but deep down she knew she wasn't. Something was growing, slowly, quietly, and dangerously, but the tension wasn't one-sided. He, too, seemed more aware of her than before. Whenever she entered the room, he acknowledged her presence even when surrounded by important discussions. When the staff gathered for instructions, his eyes would find her, not in a way that crossed boundaries, but as though her presence brought some unspoken reassurance. He noticed when she looked tired, when she looked worried, when she avoided meeting his gaze. And sometimes, very carefully, he tried to ease the distance she kept between them. "Are you settling in well?" he would ask, or "If there's ever anything you need, let me know." Simple questions, harmless words. Yet the softness behind them felt like a gentle hand knocking on the door of her guarded heart. The mansion staff noticed the growing tension long before she realized how visible it had become. Whispered glances began to follow her. Quiet smiles appeared when she entered the kitchen. A few maids teased her gently, asking if the boss had spoken to her again, but she brushed them off, cheeks flushed, insisting nothing was happening. She didn't want gossip. She didn't want assumptions. She wanted everything to remain professional, controlled, predictable. But the more she tried to push the tension away, the more it tightened around her. She felt exposed, like the entire household could see the emotions she fought so hard to hide. And in a place where rumors could turn into storms, her growing awareness of him felt more dangerous than ever. The tension reached a peak the day a storm rolled across the city, turning the sky dark and the mansion colder than usual. She had been carrying a stack of folded linens down the hallway when a sudden thunderclap startled her, causing her to drop everything. Before she could bend down to gather the scattered sheets, he was already there, kneeling beside her, helping without hesitation. The moment their hands brushed over the same piece of fabric, a spark shot through her so strong she nearly pulled away. He paused for a second, his fingers gently freezing in place, his eyes lifting to meet hers. That brief moment, filled with surprise, softness, and an unmistakable depth, felt like the air around them had stopped moving entirely. Neither spoke, neither moved. The silence between them was louder than thunder. After that moment, nothing inside her was the same. She tried to pretend the tension was all in her imagination, but she knew better now. She had felt it, felt him, felt the connection neither of them had dared to acknowledge. The space between them had become charged with unspoken emotion, a delicate line they balanced on without meaning to. She feared what it meant, feared what it could turn into, feared how close she was to crossing boundaries she had always sworn she'd never approach. Yet at the same time, her heart trembled with a truth she could no longer deny. Something was happening between them, something real, something neither of them had intended, but both of them felt. The turning point came on a morning that began like any other quiet, routine, predictable. She was cleaning the glass windows of the study, her movements steady and practiced, when she overheard raised voices echoing from the hallway. It was unusual. The mansion was always controlled, orderly, almost too silent at times. Curiosity tugged at her, but discipline pulled harder. She continued wiping, telling herself it wasn't her place to listen, but the voices grew louder, and one of them, deep, firm, unmistakably familiar, made her freeze. It was him, and he sounded different, frustrated, tense, carrying an edge she had never heard from him before. The house manager stood with him, attempting to calm him, but he brushed the man off, running a hand through his hair in agitation before walking toward the study. She immediately stepped back, lowering her gaze, trying to look busy despite her trembling hands. He entered abruptly, not expecting anyone inside, and the moment he saw her, his expression softened, not in a romantic way, but in a way that revealed exhaustion, stress, and vulnerability. His tie was loosened, his usually composed demeanor shaken. She had never seen him like this. For a second, she didn't know whether to leave or stay. But before she could decide, he spoke. "You don't have to go." His voice was low, strained, yet gentle. She hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. He walked toward the large wooden desk and placed his hands on its edge, taking a deep breath. Something inside her shifted at the sight. He wasn't the unshakable figure the world believed him to be. He was human, carrying burdens she could only guess at. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably until he finally spoke again, this time in a tone that surprised her with its honesty. "People think having everything makes life easier," he said quietly. "But some days, it feels like it all comes crashing down." She didn't dare respond. She wasn't supposed to comment, wasn't supposed to comfort. She was just a maid. But something in his voice, tired, vulnerable, almost defeated, pulled at her heart. Before she could stop herself, she whispered softly, "It will pass." He looked up at her then, almost startled by the sound of her voice. Their eyes met, and for the first time he didn't look at her as an employee. He looked at her as someone who had offered him a moment of unexpected solace. What happened next was something she never could have prepared for. As he approached her to thank her, a framed photo on a nearby shelf suddenly slipped, perhaps from vibration, perhaps from the earlier argument, and fell toward her. Without thinking, he reached out, pulling her toward him as the frame shattered on the floor. The movement brought them far too close. Her breath caught. His hand remained gently on her arm, steadying her, making sure she wasn't hurt. For a heartbeat, just one, they stood so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath, the rise and fall of his chest, the unspoken emotion swirling between them like a quiet storm. His eyes searched hers, filled with something deep and conflicted. She didn't pull away, not immediately. The world outside seemed to silence itself, leaving only the pounding of her heart and the undeniable tension between them. Realizing what had happened, he stepped back quickly, removing his hand from her as if burned by his own impulse. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer, shaken, almost unsure for the first time she had ever heard. She shook her head gently, unable to speak. Her heart raced with an intensity that frightened her. She didn't understand what the moment meant, whether it was purely instinctive or something more dangerous. But one thing was certain, something inside both of them had cracked open, something that couldn't be undone. He began picking up the broken pieces of the frame, and when she bent down to help, their hands brushed again. This time, he didn't pull away immediately. Just for a second, he lingered, as if trying to understand the unfamiliar feeling unfolding in that small, fragile space between them. The incident, simple, innocent, yet emotionally charged, changed everything. After that day, neither of them could pretend the connection didn't exist. He became more cautious around her, almost overly careful, as if afraid his emotions would betray him again. She, on the other hand, found herself replaying the moment endlessly. The warmth of his hand, the fear in his eyes when the frame fell, the way he had instinctively protected her. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a confession, but it was real. And in that moment, something unexpected had indeed happened. Their worlds, which had always remained strictly separate, had collided. Not through intention, but through a fragile, accidental moment that neither of them could ignore. In the days following the incident, she found herself caught in a quiet storm of emotions she had no name for. There were moments when she tried to convince herself that what happened meant nothing, that it was simply instinct, an automatic reaction born from concern, nothing more. But every time she touched the spot on her arm where his hand had held her, she felt the truth trembling beneath her denial. Something between them had shifted. Something delicate yet powerful had begun to grow, and no amount of logic could make it disappear. At night, she would sit on her small bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, wondering how something as simple as a moment could change the direction of two lives so drastically. She wasn't foolish enough to believe she understood love, but she recognized sincerity, fear, and tenderness when she felt them, and that moment had held all three. Yet along with her unspoken yearning came something else, fear. Not fear of him, but fear of herself, fear of wanting something she had no right to want, fear of stepping into a world where she didn't belong. She knew the rules of society too well to ignore them. People like him did not end up with people like her. Even kindness had limits in a world built on class, status, and expectations. She worried that her emotions were a betrayal of her own principles, the values her parents had struggled to teach her, humility, restraint, and the importance of knowing one's limits. But the heart rarely cared for boundaries drawn by society. And despite her desperate attempts to hold on to control, she felt herself slipping further into a space she had always feared entering. The space where hope begins to grow. He, too, was struggling in ways only she could sense. Whenever they crossed paths, he carried an unfamiliar tension around him, subtle, almost hidden, but impossible for her to ignore. His eyes avoided hers more often. His voice grew gentler, as though afraid that strength might reveal too much. And when their hands brushed by accident in the hallway or during a shared task, he would pull away quickly, but not before she saw the brief flash of emotion in his eyes. Surprise, longing, confusion, and something dangerously close to affection. He had always been composed, controlled, a man shaped by responsibility and routine. But now he seemed conflicted, as though his heart had stepped into a place his mind refused to acknowledge. And she felt guilty for being the reason behind that internal war. What neither of them said, what neither dared to even fully think, was the truth lingering silently between them. Love is not always convenient, nor does it always choose the right time or the right people. Sometimes it arrives unexpectedly, like a candle lit in a room that was meant to remain dark. Sometimes it finds you in the spaces where it is least allowed to exist. And sometimes the heart forms a connection long before the mind has time to reject it. Their bond, spoken, fragile, forbidden, was a quiet rebellion against everything they had been taught. She knew she should stay away. He knew he should keep his distance, but feelings had a way of slipping through the cracks of logic until they became impossible to ignore. As the tension deepened, she began to realize something important about love, something she never learned from fairy tales or stories whispered among friends. Love is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, growing in the spaces where fear and longing coexist. Sometimes it is simply the awareness of someone's presence, the comfort in their voice, the understanding that they see you in ways others never have. And as much as she tried to deny it, she knew one thing with painful clarity. She cared for him deeply. Not for his wealth, not for his status, not for his charm, though those things surrounded him like a polished armor, but for the person he was beneath it all. The man who listened when no one else had time, who noticed details others overlooked, who showed vulnerability behind closed doors. He, too, seemed to understand the unspoken truth that had begun to tie their lives together. The way he looked at her now held a quiet conflict, part desire, part hesitation, part fear of consequences neither of them could fully anticipate. She could see him wrestling with questions. Was he willing to risk the stability he had built? Was he prepared to challenge the expectations others had placed upon him? Could he allow himself to feel something for someone society would say was beneath him? These questions lingered in his silence, in the pauses before he spoke, in the way his gaze softened, but never lingered too long. His struggle wasn't just emotional. It was moral, societal, and deeply personal. And so, their story reached a point where emotion and reality collided. They stood on opposite sides of a line that neither dared to cross, yet their hearts kept pulling them forward. She understood now that the core of their connection wasn't about desire or charm. It was about two souls recognizing each other in unexpected circumstances. Love, if that was what it was turning into, was never about perfection or timing. It was about courage, and in that mansion, filled with silence, secrets, and unspoken tension, both of them were slowly learning that the most dangerous kind of love is the kind that feels right, even when the world insists it's wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end, their story stands as a reminder that love does not always enter our lives gently, nor does it always follow the rules we try so desperately to enforce. Sometimes it arrives uninvited, shaking the foundation of everything we believed was certain. Their connection, a maid and her employer, two people from different worlds, was never meant to happen, yet it unfolded with a force neither of them could resist. But beyond the spark of attraction, beyond the whispered conversations and dangerous emotions, lies a deeper truth. Love, when real, does not ask for permission. It grows in the spaces where we least expect it, challenging us to choose between the life we know and the life we secretly long for. And while their bond began in silence and secrecy, it awakened something powerful within both of them: courage, vulnerability, and a longing to rewrite the boundaries set by society. Their journey was not about perfection. It was about discovering the parts of themselves they had long ignored. It was about learning that sometimes the heart's most reckless choices are also its most honest ones. And though the world around them may have judged, they found meaning in each other's presence, meaning that neither status nor circumstance could erase. So let their story serve as a reminder to all of us. Love is not always convenient. It is not always safe. It does not always wait for the right moment. But when it arrives, raw, unexpected, and undeniable, it asks us only one thing: to feel deeply, fearlessly, and fully, even when the path it opens is uncertain. And perhaps in that uncertainty, we discover the most human part of ourselves.